From tightening the economic noose on Russian energy to appointing the architect of America's next great defense strategy, the House was essentially positioning the country for a high-stakes global conflict yesterday, even as it paused to discipline its own members for their conduct on the floor.
It was a striking split screen, Paige. On one hand, you have these high-level maneuvers involving global energy markets and multi-theater military planning. On the other, you have a resolution to condemn someone for a post on social media. It really captures the dual nature of the House, trying to steer the ship of state through a storm while still arguing over who gets to stand where on the deck.
Exactly. Welcome to Floor Notes for April 10th, 2026. I'm Paige.
And I'm Reed. We're looking at the Congressional Record from yesterday, Thursday, April 9th. The sheer volume of legislation introduced yesterday was staggering. If you were to print it all out, you'd be looking at a very heavy stack of paper.
Let's start with that mobilization energy. If you look at the record from yesterday, there's a cluster of bills that show the House is moving beyond the broad brush sanctions we saw last year. They're getting surgical, and they're getting aggressive. Democratic Representative Gregory Meeks of New York introduced H.R. 8222, which is specifically designed to nullify certain general licenses that allowed Russian oil and petroleum products to be sold to India and other partners recently. He's effectively saying the grace period is over.
Meeks wasn't alone in this push. Republican Representative Bill Huizenga of Michigan and Democratic Representative Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, among others, were part of this flurry. But H.R. 8220, introduced by Republican Representative George Latimer of New York, is particularly sharp. It targets Iran-related General License U, which had authorized the sale of Iranian crude loaded on vessels as recently as March 20th of this year. This moves past mere rhetoric. It's an attempt to stop the physical movement of oil that's already on the water.
It's a massive expansion of the economic arsenal. If you remember the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025, that was the one that introduced those 500% tariffs on Russian goods. What we're seeing now in the transcript is an attempt to close the side doors. They're looking at secondary sanctions on foreign firms, and even tightening the screws on uranium exports. It's clear the House feels the previous efforts didn't quite achieve the total isolation they were aiming for.
Which brings us to the domestic side of this, because you can't squeeze global energy markets without feeling the impact at the local gas station or in your utility bill. This is where H.R. 8214 comes in. It was introduced by Democratic Representative Sheila Cherfilus McCormick of Florida. The title alone tells the story. It seeks to provide emergency targeted relief to middle-income Americans facing higher costs of living arising from war-related disruptions in global energy markets.
That's a direct acknowledgement of the tension here. You want to cripple the adversary's economy, but you have to keep your own constituents from bearing the full weight of that strategy. The bill also mentions preventing war profiteering in essential goods. It's a very 1940s-style approach to a 2026 problem.
Think of it like a pressure valve. If the sanctions on Russia and Iran are the pistons moving faster and faster, this bill is the mechanism trying to make sure the domestic engine doesn't overheat. But what's interesting is how specific the House is getting about the causes of our energy grid pressure. The energy squeeze isn't solely a byproduct of external wars.
You're talking about H.R. 8241, right? Representative Paul Tonko, a Democrat from New York, introduced that one. It's about data centers.
Exactly. It's a technical bill with massive implications. It aims to promote the creation of data center load queues and data center-specific rate classes. Basically, the House is looking at how these massive data centers, the ones powering AI and cloud computing, are consuming so much electricity that they might be driving up costs for residential users. They want to put data centers in their own queue so they don't crowd out the average consumer.
It's a recognition that our energy security isn't just about where we get the oil. It's about how we manage the electricity we already have, especially when the demand is skyrocketing because of the tech boom. So you have this two-pronged energy strategy. Block the bad guys from selling their oil and manage the domestic grid so it doesn't collapse under the weight of AI and wartime inflation. It's a heavy lift for the Department of Energy.
And while they're figuring out the energy, they're also looking at the literal battlefields of the future. That brings us to our next big story, which features a name that Hill veterans will know very well, Jane Harman.
If you check the record for yesterday, specifically page H2827, there's a notice that carries a lot of weight. Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican from Louisiana, appointed Jane Harman to the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. For those who don't know, Jane Harman was a Democratic representative from California for years and served as the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee. She's essentially the institutional memory of American defense policy.
Her return to this specific role is a significant signal. This commission was established by the fiscal year 2026 NDAA to basically rewrite the playbook for the 2025 National Defense Strategy. The last time Harman chaired a commission like this, they issued a chilling report. They warned that the U.S. is fundamentally unprepared for a no-limits partnership between China and Russia.
The transcript shows that her appointment is tied to a shift in how the House wants the military to think. For decades, the goal was to be able to win one major war while deterring another. Now, they are discussing a multiple theater force construct. That is jargon for, we need to be able to fight in Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific all at the same time.
It's a massive departure from the post-Cold War era. Harman's expertise is being brought in to bridge the gap between traditional military power, tanks and ships, and what she calls the elements of national power. That means using diplomacy, tech innovation, and economic sanctions as a unified front. The House is looking for more than an increase in munitions. They're asking for a strategy that prevents the need for them by deterring these no-limits partnerships before they solidify.
There's a direct quote from the Commission's previous findings that caught my eye because it sets the stakes for Harman's new role. The record notes the Commission found that the threats the United States faces are the most serious and most challenging the nation has encountered since 1945. That's a sobering assessment.
And you can see that reflected in the bills introduced alongside her appointment. For instance, look at H.R. 8243, introduced by Democratic Representative Eugene Vindman of Virginia. It's a bill directing the Secretary of Defense to brief Congress on the feasibility of using virtual constructive training to optimize the amount of in-air training. They're looking for ways to keep pilots sharp using virtual reality, because flight hours are expensive and the demand for those pilots in actual theaters is rising.
Vindman also introduced H.R. 8244, which asks for a report on proficiency flights in the National Capital Region. There's this sense that every resource, every flight hour, every gallon of fuel needs to be accounted for, because the strategy is stretching so thin across these multiple theaters. It's about maintaining readiness without burning through the budget before a conflict even starts.
It's about efficiency during escalation. We're seeing a House that is genuinely worried about the capacity of the current force. They aren't just rubber-stamping the Pentagon's requests. They're asking, if the worst-case scenario happens, a simultaneous conflict on 3 fronts, are we actually ready? Bringing Jane Harman back suggests the answer they currently have is not yet. They need her to help build the roadmap to yes.
It's heavy stuff. But while the House is staring down global conflict, they're also doing the paperwork. Yesterday was what we call a great committee clearing.
This is the retail side of Congress. We talk about the big picture strategy, but the House is still a place where people try to get very specific, very local things done. Yesterday, committees reported 15 bills for floor consideration, and members introduced 35 more. It's a fascinating mix of the monumental and the mundane.
It really is. You have H.R. 8211 from Democratic Representative Alma Adams of North Carolina, which would place a monument in Arlington National Cemetery honoring Army Security Agency veterans. Those were the codebreakers and signals intelligence soldiers who often served in silence. Then you have H.R. 8225 from Republican Representative Blake Moore of Utah to rename a post office in Tremonton, Utah as the Sorensen Estrada Post Office.
And then you jump to something totally different, H.R. 8226, by Democratic Representative Gerald Nadler of New York, which would mandate safety equipment and training for turbine-powered helicopters. This is a response to specific tragic accidents in urban corridors. It's that localized legislating. One minute you're planning for a war with Russia, the next you're trying to make sure Tor helicopters don't crash in Manhattan.
The tension here, though, is whether any of this moves. The floor schedule is so dominated by international crises and internal drama. If you're Alma Adams and you want that monument in Arlington, you're competing for oxygen with the National Defense Strategy and energy sanctions. It's a tough environment for quiet legislation.
And that's where the procedural tools come in. I noticed several references to Calendar Wednesday. For the folks at home, that's a rarely used rule where a committee chair can call up a bill directly from their committee to the floor, bypassing the leadership's gatekeeping. It's a way for committees like Ways and Means or Education in the Workforce to say, our work matters too.
Specifically, the Ways and Means Committee is pushing bills that help meet budget reconciliation targets for the 119th Congress. We saw H.R. 8214, the Energy Relief Bill, get referred there. But we also saw H.R. 8242 from Republican Representative Mike Turner of Ohio, which aims to extend the health coverage tax credit. This is the nuts and bolts of government that keeps things running while the headlines focus elsewhere.
I was also struck by H.R. 8235, introduced by Democratic Representative Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts. It's a bill to require certain libraries to maintain a diverse collection of books. That's a direct entry into the cultural debates happening at the state level, brought right to the House floor. It's a reminder that even in the middle of a global energy crisis, the ideological battles over education and representation don't pause.
And don't forget, H.R. 8213 from Republican Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina, which seeks to clarify that sex discrimination in the Civil Rights Act doesn't include gender identity. So, within the same 24-hour period, you have the House trying to define the future of global warfare and the legal definition of gender. The breadth of their portfolio is just incredible.
It's a lot for any institution to handle. And sometimes, that pressure leads to a bit of a breakdown in decorum, which leads us to the kicker.
While the House spent the day drafting these grand strategies for global stability and multi-theater deterrence, they also introduced House Resolution 1159. Representative Al Green, a Democrat from Texas, submitted this resolution condemning the hateful and Islamophobic post of Representative Andy Ogles. Ogles is a Republican from Tennessee.
It's the ultimate contrast. On page H2827, they're appointing Jane Harmon to address existential threats. And on page H2829, they're formally complaining about a social media post. It's a reminder that no matter how big the stakes are globally, the House remains a room full of 435 individuals who often have deep personal and ideological animosities.
The resolution has been referred to the Committee on Ethics. It's a move that essentially suggests the House cannot have a serious conversation about national defense if it can't maintain basic civility on the floor. Whether it leads to actual discipline is another story. Ethics investigations move at their own pace, but the timing is telling. It highlights the friction of trying to lead the world while being deeply divided at home.
It's like trying to run a Fortune 500 company while the board of directors is having a shouting match in the parking lot. You might have the best strategy in the world, but if the people in the room can't get along, the implementation is going to be incredibly difficult.
The record from April 9th really does show a House of Representatives pulled in two different directions: the need to act as a global superpower and the reality of being a collection of local politicians with very personal grievances. It's a difficult balance to maintain.
And that is the House in a nutshell. A place where you can try to stop an oil tanker in the Persian Gulf and rename a post office in Utah all before lunch.
And on that note, that's Floor Notes for today.
And I'm Reed. We'll see you next time. Try to keep it civil out there, everyone.